Baltimore and the U.S. President Warfield is being promoted with a harbor model at the City Hall. Passengers now boarding for a Moonlight Norfolk cruise. Baltimore, the intersection of Pratt and Light Streets. This spot is the home of the USS President Warfield, where we will be leaving on an overnight cruise to Norfolk. Over the years, much of Baltimore embarked on this first night of their honeymoons aboard her. The overnight boat lives fondly in the memories of many older couples of dining, dancing, and even lovemaking. A family coming down the gangplank for a weekend on the beautiful Chesapeake Bay. The old port of Baltimore, with steamboats lining her waterfront, she is well known by sailing men as a good time town. There are bars and bawdy shows to be enjoyed. Women of the night satisfy the lust of sailors in port for a night or a week. Passengers standing on deck let out the customary cheer, waving farewell to Baltimore as the feel of the first shudder of power from the engines goes through the vessel. They receive the same from pedestrians all along the sidewalk as well as a few goodbye waves from car windows. Dance, 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 dance the night away. Fort Carroll, built after the War of 1812 to catch marauding ships in a crossfire between it and Fort McHenry. To port stands a Goliath, its Bessemer Steel Spars Point Division. The giant consumes a shipload of ore and as much coal daily. We have passed eastward out of the Patapsco River and are in the bay. Close by stands 7-foot knoll. As we move east, it will line up with Craig Hill Light at the end of Miller's Island. When aligned, we will know to head south in the Baltimore Channel. Rumor has it the fish are scarce on the Grand Banks and the Blue Nose Fleet is in the bay looking for fertile grounds. Ladies and gentlemen, your meals have been prepared and will be served in the dining room. Dinner is now being served. Early in December, with warm water eddying into the bay from an offshore tropical Gulf Stream, It is a warm and beautiful night that is not wasted on the passengers. With soft music wafting from the main salon, there is a dreaminess in the air. As we pass the edge of Poquoson Flats, fishermen are often said to set their dollar pocket watches by our timely passing. We will soon be coming up on Old Point Comfort, where honeymoon passengers will disembark to stay at the Chamberlain Hotel and Sun on Buckrow Beach. Above the offshore waters, the clouds of war are gathering. U-boats patrol the coastal waters of America. We know it won't be long. The Navy puts personnel aboard at Norfolk, and our little ship is now the USS President Warfield, and she is part of the coastal defense. Among young Americans, there is a sense of desperation to enjoy life. There is recklessness among the women and reluctance among men to leave a young bride at home. I may not return was often said. It was a hard truth. They sing too loud, dance too hard, and laugh too much. The future is uncertain. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto leads an attack on China, who is nearly defenseless. Millions will die. This is the story of war. Strong nations against weak. The lesson is never be weak. There is a sickening in America by the ruthlessness of the Japanese against the helpless Chinese people. American barnstormers arrive in China to fly Chinese worn-out old Curtiss P-40 fighters. They fought the Chinese enemy with flying skills never seen by the Japanese. They attacked by day and repaired these old planes by night with scavenged parts. The eyes hauled gasoline, oil, and ammo across thousands of mountainous miles on Burma Road to be flown over the Himalayan hump to the Resistance and the Flying Tigers. The route claimed thousands of American lives. Airplanes were literally knocked out of the air by mountainous storms. Happy Boyington, a flying tiger, but too undisciplined for his new Air Force commanding officer, General Chenault.
Vor der Kaserne, vor dem großen Tor, steht eine Laterne und steht sie noch davor. Dort wollen wir uns wiedersehen, bei der Laterne wollen wir stehen, wie einst Lili Marleen, wie einst Lili Marleen.
King Leopold surrenders to German might. Dunkirk. 300,000 British soldiers are pushed into the sea by the Nazi army. They are rescued by an armada of small boats from England. Benito Mussolini rallies the Italian. while Paris surrenders personally to Adolf Hitler. Europe is his.
Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. I ask the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between
Baltimoreans were settled about the old night boat, as she was called. Rowing skiffs drifted and fished down the bay to return on the tide. A local newspaper provided a table of time the President Warfield would pass different points on the bay and rivers. So in the blackness of night, a fisherman knew where he was on the bay by the time of passing of the night boat. The President Warfield and lighthouses were the only dependable markers the fishermen had among cloudy and clearing skies and varying wind and wave. When the word came out the steamboat was to leave the bay to take part in a battle of Europe, she was welcomed home with celebration. Hundreds gathered in the scaffolding of shipyards to honor her passing on her return from Norfolk. Sailboats and skiffs met her along her way up the Patapsco River with bell and whistle all the way to home port. Baltimore, a town in search of a party, found reason they needed, and party they did. On her way up the Patapsco River and nearing Baltimore, the proud USS President Warfield dipped her flag in salute to both Fort Carroll and Fort McHenry. A large number of her passengers stood teary-eyed with pride as they stood ramrod straight, hand over hearts. They could have no idea what part the little boat would play in the world's troubles in the coming years. In only a few months, she would be off on a world adventure. Arriving at the dock in Baltimore, they were surprised to find the town in celebration. They were marching in the streets, carrying flags and throwing firecrackers. A freedom-loving America is forced into war, and we accepted the challenge with action. Boys and girls collected aluminum to build airplanes. People worked 6 days a week in factories and produced war materials 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. America produced steel in amounts unheard of and immediately turned it into weapons of war. Kaiser, California shipbuilding built a Liberty ship a day. We built ships faster than the Germans could build torpedoes. The ships were filled with tools of war. By such means, we did the impossible. We successfully mounted an invasion of North Africa. Germany's military, with 1,000 years of war experience, was not a match for peace-loving America, who just wanted to get back to peace and prosperity and the love of freedom and life. The Allied lost 3 million tons of shipping. German undersea boats were celebrating the happy days as the Jerry's called the massive sinking of Allied ships. The President Warfield had made her way up the Delaware-Chesapeake Canal out of the Delaware Bay to meet her sister ships, Yorktown, Northland, Southland, Virginia Lee, and several more. It was a time for the steamboats to go to war. The Maniac Convoy, as it was called, was headed out into the North Atlantic in the beginning of the prime autumn storm season without escort, and were lucky to arrive in safe harbor in Newfoundland. The ships had set at anchor in Newfoundland Conception Bay to wait for the British naval destroyers to arrive as their escort. The British crews were heroic adventures in the mold of early polar explorers. Now they were on their way. The RB-1 riverboat convoy moved out of Newfoundland in 2 columns. The HMS Veteran and the HMS Bannock served as their destroyer escorts. In the coming weeks, periscopes were spotted. The Southland opened up with her 12-pounder, while Captain Williams of the President Warfield shouted, "Right wheel steady." The little ship turned sharply, and the running torpedo that was to deliver her death blow passed by not 30 feet away. Her 12-pounder was fired, and the recoil nearly tore the deck off. The 20-meter gun tubs fired on. HMS Veteran came to rescue at flank speed, depth charging. Warfield headed off to the northeast to escape the attack. The New York was torpedoed, and the HMS Bannock, coming to her rescue, was hit and sank. At the end of December, HMS Veteran came to rescue at flank speed depth charging. Warfield headed off to the northeast to escape the attack. The New Yorker was torpedoed, and the HMS Bannock, coming to her rescue, was hit and sank. At the end of December, the USS President Warfield entered the North Channel past the Mole of Kintyre in safety. The U-boat submerged to the safety of the depths. Back home in England, RB-1's positions were plotted to avoid known positions of U-boats. The riverboats are now 800 miles off the coast of England, are out of danger from the subs that come up from behind them. Subs are faster than the steamboats, but must submerge to attack with the underwater speed much slower. They would have to stay surface to catch up and would have to match guns with the destroyer. Surviving boats made England's ports.
In Dublin's fair city, where girls are so pretty, I first set me eyes on sweet Molly Malone. She wheeled the wheel.
Captain Williams, calm and collected, called down on the ship's intercom. Gentlemen, land ho!
Alive, alive, oh, alive, alive.
Roll of Kintyre rises from the sea as the hours pass. All hands watch for U-boats anxiously as the USS President Warfield nears the safety of home for these British seamen.
Was no wonder, for so were her father and mother before. They both wheeled the barrow through streets broad and narrow, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh. She died of a fever, no one could save her, and that was the end of sweet Molly Malone. Now her ghost wheels the barrow through streets broad and narrow, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh, alive.
U.S. President Warfield, a one-time luxurious honeymoon steamboat, now driven hard into the river mud of the Targe and Tall Rivers at Appledore. The USS President Warfield has crossed the North Atlantic and is now stationed in Appledore, Scotland. She had reached the end of her usefulness to England. She was inducted into the United States Navy with an all-American crew. Her new commanding officer was USN Lieutenant G.W. Boyer, all Navy. Her crew was described as a bunch of ragtag feather merchants. The new skipper tightened both ship and crew to make one. His crew, the dregs of the Navy, drunken, brawling seamen who made good use of the old ship's comforts. My older brother, Charles F. Pollard, Jr., a machinist, and a young man known to march to a different drummer, was part of the so-called Black Gang of Three. He ran the old steam engine and water maker. Journeyman machinists all insulted at being called firemen. The look on their faces says it all. The President Warfield, stuck in the mud, was pulled out after hours of effort. The tugs wig-wagged her stern back and forth while pulling for what seemed an eternity until she began to be freed. She was once a barracks and now a ship again. Her British crew took her to sea, where they lowered her ensign, and the U.S. ensign was raised by the American sailors. The British crew, boarding a captain's gig, their duty complete, headed back to Barry. The now United States Navy IX-169, her new designation, set out to her new destination, Plymouth, England. After one day at sea, the water maker broke down. They had to switch to salt water to make steam, which meant a boiler cleaning and repair at the shipyard in Plymouth. This created the hope they would not have to beach a tin-plated wooden ship, as they were wont to call her, to be splintered on a fortified German-occupied coast. The Black Gang fixer of all things mechanical fixed the Chief's Victrola. Music is old, but better than none was enjoyed by all. The old girl is faster without the heavy load of fuel she carried on her Atlantic crossing. Out of respect for her age, she is kept under 15 knots as she again feels the swell of the great North Atlantic. The little ship, now in convoy, found itself under attack by U-boats while the aircraft attacked the U-boats with depth charges. passed. The rising sun and the port of Plymouth greeted the crew's eyes. They were amazed and transfixed at the thousands of ships anchored and docked. Battleships dressed in jagged camouflage war paint swung menacingly at anchor. Troop ships on the docks and LSTs lying along the beach, ready to receive troops, jeeps, and army trucks. High in the air above the ships were stationed barrage balloons. They were tethered by a thick cable that prevented German Stuka dive bombers from diving, bombing, and strafing the ships. Everyone knew the battle for Europe was at hand. The big question was, will we be part of it? The thought was exciting and at the same time tinged with dread, told to me by one who was there. Well, I feel like I am late for my own funeral, Fireman Bill Horney blurted out. There was snickering among his mates lined up along the ship's bulwarks with him. As the President Warfield approached the harbor, the day's airplane raids on Germany were leaving bases in England. All heavily loaded with bombs and fuel, their engines gave out a deafening roar as they struggled to gain altitude. Mulberries to build a harbor to protect invading GIs on a fortified beach. The white cliffs of Dover highlight the horizon. There is no army coming across the channel, and the weather is worsening, so the German officers go home to bask in their arrogant glory. Day after day, landing barges, tanks, guns, ammo, and thousands of troops, British, Canadians, Americans, all with one purpose. Finish this job and get back home. The Nazis will feel the power in the weapons they wielded. Weapons the parents, sisters, sweethearts built with their labor. All this combined might coming together in the seaport of Britain to board ships and fight their way to Berlin. With radio silence in effect, the ship signaled the shipyard by semaphore. The crew was marched off to army barracks as quarters for the week. The bilges were to be steam cleaned and sanitized, mechanical work on the water maker and rebuilt. There were poker games all the time and much shut-eye taken. Everyone knew there was going to be an invasion of Europe, but did not know when. They were ordered not to speak of it among themselves. They were guarded by Marines and MPs to keep the silence. There was no leave. The second night, an army truck pulled up to the barracks and loaded soldiers and sailors alike on board for a mysterious night trip into the countryside. The final destination was Slapton Sands. Came out years later and was actually on a website on the internet. The troops on this catastrophic landing had no training in beach invasion. The officers decided to give them some. They sent out LSTs with landing barges and tanks fitted with flotation collars. The collars failed and the tanks sunk. That afternoon there was to be a destroyer escort. It collided with a landing barge in Plymouth Harbor, leaving the landing group naked at sea. They were to land at night, and they approached the beach. They were torpedoed by 3 German torpedo boats. A German friend who served aboard one of the German torpedo boats out of Cherbourg years later claimed to have caught the ship's landing troops on a British beach and sunk several. I think it was Slapton Sands. Still, can't be sure. They were shooting at the troops, and so were the batteries, thinking it was a German invasion after seeing the torpedo boat. The landing group flotilla was caught in a crossfire. There were over 750 GIs killed. My one-time friend could never be considered a friend again. I just could not bring myself to ever call him friend. The tank was one of those that sank offshore. In recent years, she was retrieved from the sea and placed on the beach as a monument to those who died here. It has only been in recent years that their families found out where their men died. Well, happy day. We have a reunion here. Nushan of Woods Hole, Massachusetts, that once crossed the Atlantic in company with the USS President Warfield, has rafted up alongside. She has been converted to a hospital ship by the British, painted eye-catching white with red crosses on her hull, has fared well. Both crews visit back and forth and compare yarns. It's kind of like meeting up with a bunch of cousins. Of course, all the Nushan cousins are Brits. The old hand-crank Victrola spins them up, but the records are old, 1924. Things have been happening in recent days. Ship loading has picked up. Soldiers beginning to load, trucks, artillery, and tanks loading. Thousands of troops have marched into town from out in the country. They are hauled out to anchored ships. Every place and everything is busy. Number of bombers taking off landing are increasing. Trains full of men are on the move. There is no shore leave. Everyone is being watched for talk. Secrecy, secrecy, secrecy. Even the secrecy is telling. Another telling observation is the nurses are moving aboard Nushan. Generals walk around shaking hands with troops. Things are beginning to happen. Everyone watches and giving each other looks, but no one talks. The crew has gained respect for the old ship, and all have begun to feel affection for her. The black gang made up a good-natured song on behalf of her ancient machinery. Pollard wrote a poem about her, and the other firemen put it to music. Oh, we call her ship the Warfield, she's the finest in the fleet, and when it comes to making time, she simply can't be beat. Her boilers old and rusty, but they're full of dynamite, and puff of smoke, one splash of brine, and then she's out of sight. Oh, her pistons clang, her engines bang, and her whistle toots away. The captain cries full speed ahead, and then there's hell to pay. Her top 3 decks are made of wood, her hull is made of tin. A credit to our Navy, this grand old hulk we're in. Like a pot of water on the stove, waiting, 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 and suddenly it comes to a boil. The Allies are suddenly moved to their ships, not in the leisure way of past days. There is a sense of urgency. Loaded ships move out into the harbor and anchor. Battleships move out into the English Channel. Finally, all ships anchored and again waiting for a week. Then Nushan, the hospital ship, moves off. Nurses all on deck wave goodbye to the men of the Warfield. The old chief says to his men, "Look at that, guys. Those gals know the value of a sidelong glance, a smile, a wave, and a goodbye."
It was a funny sort of feeling marching down to the ships. We'd done it plenty of times before, of course, on schemes and that kind of thing. They didn't tell us this was the big show. Might have been just another exercise. Some of the chaps cracked gags. They wasn't very comic, but we laughed. I think we all guessed. The general feeling was, okay, if this is it, let's get in there and get it over with. Waiting always got on my nerves. Even waiting for a bus, never could stand it. Well, after a bit, our ship found its place in the middle of all the rest of the stuff. And there we stayed, for days.
They gave us the final briefing then. We knew what to do and how. They told us where and when. That's a briefing. I listened to every word. Wrote it down in my head like a record, and it kept playing over and over again. Piece of beach in the morning. Ever since I became a soldier, they were getting me ready for this. Before, there'd been time in front of me.
The day was June 5th, 1944, and it was the day of the moving out of Operation Overlord. The men on USS President Warfield heard the slapping of waves against their ship's hull, felt her roll gently. All came on deck to witness the leaving of the fleet and its many thousands of fighting men and machines. There were pangs of guilt that they were being left behind, and hoped the little ship would be called upon to perform a duty they could be proud of. Before midnight, all ships but a few were at sea. In the early dawn, more airplanes than anyone knew existed labored their way into the sky. Hundreds pulled gliders laden with troops, some loaded with paratroopers and others with bombs, circled at lower altitudes. P-38 fighters, Spitfires, and P-51 fighters climbed above the slower planes to protect them from air attack if need be. The roar filled the sky. June 6th, a day to remember. In pre-dawn, they heard it. The long, low, and distant rumble of the guns of war. Battleships, 16-inch guns, bombs dropping on the French shores. The protest of mankind heard all the way to the heavens.
Back in London, only a few people knew. It was a well-kept secret. Around daybreak, we correspondents were called and told to be at the Ministry of Information at 8. Then they told us.
It's July the 4th, a month after D-Day, and the U.S. President Warfield is preparing to head for Utah Beach. America's workhorses, the DC-3, paying out the tow lines that will pull hundreds of gliders into the air. They will land behind the Nazi lines, carrying thousands of troops and equipment. Sunrise is splitting the dull gray dawn. Machinery repairman Charles Pollard finished his trick at the throttle. Steps on deck, walking astern, lights up. In the distance he hears the whine of engines. Coming on fast is a B-26 bomber buzzing low. Just to port, she wigwags, opens throttles, and wigwags again to climb. A second plane is heading. Sunrise is splitting the dull gray dawn. Machinery repairman PBM Mariner. He feels the hair raise on the back of his neck. The flying boat is a subchaser. Close behind comes the high-pitched whine of a P-38 fighter as she screams by. Pollard makes a dash for the engine room in case he is needed. The bridge rings down full ahead, and the race is on to catch the convoy on the horizon, where they will be among many, well protected. The Warfield did not catch up with the convoy as they made the Omaha Beach artificial harbor ahead of her. With fine weather, she had a pleasant crossing, though a bit worried. She found her place among the many ships acting as a breakwater for the LST's unloading there. She served as an office quarters for the harbor management as well as a rest station for exhausted troops to have a couple days of rest. The story was told that the crew had to sweep shrapnel off the decks every morning from the anti-aircraft fire from the fleet. A German aircraft dropped a mine a couple hundred yards behind the Warfield. The boatswain's mate tied a buoy on the anchor, placed it near the mine. The next day, an LST came into the harbor heading for the buoy with half the crew of the Warfield shouting and waving them off. The ship was blown up. Some of the Warfield's crew stole the captain's gig and ran out and rescued some of the crew. A few days later, the harbor was destroyed by an onshore storm. In the next few days, the Warfield was moved to Port Le Havre.
When the German port strategy became apparent, we had to move swiftly to counteract his plan. We captured Cherbourg in a mighty rush, but he hung on to other harbors, and when he couldn't do that, he destroyed them. That was the story at Brest, where American ground, air, and naval forces fought such a long, bitter battle.
The President Warfield was really in pretty foul condition. In Devon, she had been abused as a barrack ship and again in Normandy. Storms came ashore and battered her. Troops moved aboard, relaxed, and headed out. She served to break the waves that battered the shoreline in storms so the supplies could be moved ashore. She was reworked some in a yard at Le Havre and finally sent up the Seine River, hauling 700 or 800 troops per trip. She carried troops to the cigarette camps as they were named. She wound her way up the river through sharp horseshoe double-back turns that she was built to do in America. She was agile in these winding river conditions, sounding her steam whistle at every turn as a warning to others she was coming round the bend. Like a man coming over a hill singing, she had large numbers of French friends in every town and hamlet. Well, the USS President Warfield arrived at the old gold camp, offloaded 700 or 800 troops, and then stayed tied up to the dock for a couple days. The guys all played pinochle and poker, and there was a lot of pennies lost and gained, and they were waiting for orders. The radio operator got a message from the Army saying that the President Warfield should go to the Lucky Strike camp and pick up passengers. Well, that's kind of an odd thing for the Army to be calling troops. So the radio operator radioed back and said, "What kind of passengers?" The Army told me, said, "Well, there's 34 Army nurses there that need to be picked up to go to Le Havre." Ah, Army nurses, that's a fine thing, that is. So they got the steam up, fired up the engine, and off they went, downriver, headed for the Lucky Strike camp, pulled up to the dock, but there was a problem. The Army had sent jeeps to pick up the nurses. So there was a snafu. Of course, the President Warfield had an advantage. The President Warfield had staterooms, bathrooms with bathtubs, commodes, things that women rarely like. Well, the girls didn't have to think that over hardly a second, and they were ready to go downriver on the boat. They wanted to see some different scenery. They'd seen everything all blown up and busted up, and there was still a lot of beautiful scenery along the river. Went on down. The chief had a record player, and they put some old records on it. Well, the women wasn't having none of that because they had new modern big band records that had just come from the States, and they put that stuff on, and there was a dance carried on the dance floor that night. Everybody danced with the girls, and it was a big time. I don't want anybody to think there was some kind of orgy or something like that going on. There wasn't. The Army had all those nurses were officers, and there was no such thing as officers and enlisted men having affairs, and so it stayed pretty straight. Next day, over the radio come the word, the big word: the war is over. Germany has capitulated. Gentlemen, we have been successful. Well, there was screaming and hollering and crying and carrying on. The women danced a jig, and the men did too. And they went on down the river, finally pulling into Le Havre, tied up along the dock. And they waited. And they waited. And they waited and they waited. And no orders. Well, they decided the Warfield had a bent propeller where she'd hit some obstacle underwater, and so they put the boat in out dry dock, cleaned up the bottom, painted the bottom, put a new propeller on. The old one was still working, but it was bent and wasn't very efficient. And then they waited for orders. The orders finally came through that the Warfield was to go to Plymouth, England, and then head out from there in convoy for the United States. Well, the women went too. They took off and they headed out. Not too far out, they were in sight of the White Cliffs of Dover, and that was kind of an emotional sight for everybody. A few tears were shed here and there. Nearing Plymouth, the word came over the radio: the war was over. Japan had capitulated, and there would be no more fighting. Again, there was a celebration. The old ship made its way into Plymouth, and the nurses went trying to find out if they had any orders. No orders yet. So the guys couldn't figure out what to do with with all them nurses. They couldn't just turn them loose on the street. So the head nurse said, "The heck with it. Orders or no orders, we're going with you." And they left out of England, heading across the Atlantic Ocean, and they had beautiful weather. The nights were moonlit, bright sunny days, light breezes, the old engine along, and it was more like a cruise. But it didn't last. They went into the Canary Islands, fueled up because they didn't carry enough fuel across the Atlantic, and they come on out and they caught back up with the other boats because they were a little faster. There was Liberty ships and LSTs, and they couldn't run over about 7 or 8 knots. And the President Warfield, she could run 18 tops, and so they caught back up, went on their way. But there was a storm brewing. It was September, and it was hurricane season, and the weather was picking up and was cloudy, and everybody was worried they might be getting into a hurricane. Well, it turned out it wasn't a hurricane. It was a tropical depression and a storm. The waves picked up, they got big. The old ship started sliding sideways off the fronts of the waves as it was coming down, and when the bow dug in the wave in front. And she was wanting to broach. Well, if she broached, it was all over because she turned over between the waves there and filled with water and sank. So the old chief went forward. He had remembered seeing some pumps, he thought. So he went forward, and sure enough, he found 5 handy-billy gasoline pumps up there. And he got the crew to space them out over the hull and put the hoses in the bilge, and the other end of the hose out, pumping overboard. And they pumped the bilges. The engine had been throwing water all over the place because the crankshaft going round and round, dipping into the bilge and throwing water out all over the engine room was getting pretty bad. And so the pumping the bilge out took care of the problem. Everybody felt much better about it. But there was a thing going on that was a worry. The waves had dropped off some, but the boat was still rolling pretty bad. Well, it was a 50-foot section of rub rail that had come loose. And it was heavy, maybe 500 pounds. It would swing out, hit the water, and that would turn the ship a little bit, and they'd have to fight her back. And then when the boat rolled to starboard, the rub rail would slam back and hit the hull. Well, it was tearing up the plating on the side, and they were afraid it was going to knock a hole in the ship. Well, one of the black gang, who was a welder, told him that if you put a bosun's chair over the side, he'd get in it and ride down there and burn it off with a cutting torch. Well, he burned about halfway through it. The thing broke off and fell in the water. Well, for that little piece of work, he got a lot of attaboys. When an American ship comes back to the United States going home, they fly a going home pennant. It's a foot long for every man aboard. And so they had about 140 crew. And so the flag was 140 feet long. And every man gets a piece of it when they get home as a keepsake. So every man had a foot of the going home pennant. They were near Hatteras and made their way up the coast to the Chesapeake Bay Lightship, which showed up about half hour before sunrise in the gray dawn, and they rounded her, headed into Chesapeake Bay, went up the Hampton roads, through the roads, and up the Elizabeth River. Now this was home country for the President Warfield. She had been probably 1,000 times up this river, and so she was home. The ship comes into a dock ties up beside beside a tin can. And from there, the crew gets shore leave as soon as they can get ashore. My brother Charlie gets aboard a steamboat and comes up the Chesapeake Bay to Baltimore and gets off in Baltimore, rides a 26th Street car home, walks the mile to the house without telling anybody he was coming. We were really surprised to see him. They began stripping the ship. They took off her water maker and her military radios and her radar and life rafts and everything else that was Navy property. Cleaned her up, removed the deck off the bow so that she had a flat deck up there. And they took her up the James River and tied her to another ship there in the mothball fleet. She sat there a year and slowly going downhill. And then she found a buyer. So her life was not over yet. There was the matter of the 34 Army nurses. My brother Charlie said that they were not court-martialed, and he thought the captain had probably interceded for him and told the Army that he had not received any orders for the nurses, so he felt it was his decision as they were passengers aboard his ship, and he was responsible for crew, passengers, and ship, and that he wasn't about to put them off in Plymouth with no orders, so he brought them to the United States. It was his decision to make. The President Warfield was being looked at by the Old Bay Company. She would have been put in service as a ferry boat, but she couldn't haul automobiles, and the railroads were taking a big bite out of the steamship company's profits, and they just decided that $1 million to put her back into service just would make her totally unprofitable. They wouldn't be able to run her. Well, the Potomac Shipwrecking Company was looking at her. They wanted her for scrap iron price, but they decided to pay more. And so they bought her. The old ship had a future yet, though, and a noble one at that. She would be hauling prisoners from the Nazi concentration camps to Israel, to their new homeland. Well, that's another whole story.
My name is Dr. Barry Lever, and I use the term, even though I'm not practicing anymore, I was a periodontist in Pikesville. And one day in 1993, I guess it was, a gentleman, patient of mine, walks into the office and he says to me, Barry, he says, what do you know about the Exodus? And I was like, wow, I was kind of taken aback because, so I jokingly said to him, which one do you mean? Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, or the ship? And he says, no, the ship. I says, I know everything about the ship. He says, come on, how do you know everything about the ship? I says, look, trust me, I know everything about the ship because my bar mitzvah occurred the day that the United Nations voted to partition the British Mandate into two parts, a Jewish state and a potential Arab state. And that was announced on the afternoon after my bar mitzvah. This ship was the flagship of the Old Bay Line, which was the oldest oldest American bay line still in existence. In 1963, I think it shut down. But I said, so this is a very historic boat, not just from an Israeli perspective, but also from an American maritime perspective. Now, anyone who wants to really understand how the Exodus or the President Warfield became such an iconic ship has to understand a little bit about the story of the ship. I told you it had served the British. It had become the command and control ship at Normandy at the invasion of France, 30 days after the invasion, in which all ships entering and leaving Normandy beachhead had to pass through command of the President Warfield, still called the President Warfield at that time. She subsequently transported prisoners up the Seine River to Paris, or from Paris down to the Seine. Number of historic things, and sailed. So it was almost torpedoed when it was turned over to the British in '42, I believe, and then it comes back to the United States, and it's ready. It's ready to go into salvage in the James River Navy storage facility. It's headed for the junkyard. Now, this is where the story really becomes interesting, and it becomes a Jewish, if we can use that term, ship. At that time, the Haganah, it was right after, it was in a period in history where Britain was losing control of the Middle East. It didn't want to give up its mandate. It had lost badly in World War II. Many millions of people had died, of course, as you know, in World War II. And the British were hard placed to control the Middle East because they needed it. They needed it because they controlled the Suez Canal. It was the control of the oil fields in the Middle East, which provided the economic muscle. And they were very frightened and did not want to give up the mandate and their control over what they called Palestine. And so it comes at this juncture that the ship really becomes extremely important, because not only was there the Exodus, but there were 10 very large surplus, probably most surplus ships that went up for auction and were used and could be used to carry many refugees who were stuck in concentration camps or detention camps in 1944, 45, following the Second World War. Now, the Exodus, the President Warfield, being in a scrapyard in Virginia, was bought by a scrap dealer in Washington, a Jewish man, I think his name was Shapiro, and subsequently, out of that, was sold to the Haganah secretly and it was brought to Baltimore to be outfitted. As to the purchase of this ship, one of the things that we know is that every Jewish community in the United States, every time there was a card game, anytime people had money, they wanted to give tzedakah, they gave money to a fund that was eventually allocated to Haganah and got by way of the Sonneborn Commission to do all of the things that had to be done. Now, there are people that you will hear today who say, oh, my grandfather brought this ship. No, their grandfather didn't buy the ship. He may have contributed large sums of money, but he didn't buy it. The ship was bought from Boston by the head of the Haganah here in America, who was a lawyer. And this lawyer was the individual who signed the agreement to purchase the ship for $50,000. That's what it was paid for as scrap. Supposedly scrap, but as I say, brought to Baltimore and refitted. It was one of 4 such ships that Baltimore participated in, 4 out of 10, and these ships were re-outfitted right down here at the Inner Harbor. The Exodus, which was to become the Exodus, was refitted on Lancaster Street down at Fells Point, near Fells Point. The ship was ultimately crewed by American servicemen, by people who had some experience in Navy, some had no experience at all, but they had been enlisted and encouraged because they knew what had happened to the Jews of Europe, and they wanted to help in any way they could. So it's at that point that the President Warfield begins its transition into Exodus. Now, the issue becomes very serious, and these people are really now working for the Haganah. They're now under control of an American skipper, but ostensibly the command of this ship was under the control of Haganah. And so it sailed from Baltimore, and it set it out to sea, and there was all kinds of speculation where it was going, and it was supposed to go onto the Far East trade, to trade with China, but everybody really knew that this was a fiction in order to evade British interference. And it was only when it got to France and it began to load its refugees and then subsequently sail for Palestine at that time, because it wasn't yet Israel, that it changed its name to Exodus 1947, and that's how it was known. The ship was originally designed to carry 590 persons, and it wound up carrying 4,554 refugees, and they didn't have enough passports for them in the port of Set where it was loaded. It was somewhere near Marseille. When they got on board, they would take their passport or their legal documents and grab them by the handfuls and take them down and give them to the new people. So maybe they had 1,000 passports which they had drawn up, they were forgeries, and subsequently everybody used them. I don't know how many actually there were, but they were used over and over and over again to get these people past the immigration officials and on board the ship. The ship pulled out under a very, very difficult situation. The British knew that they were there. The British were hounding them every step of the way, and the ship had to break through very narrow confines of the harbor in order to get out. The end result of this voyage is that the British capture the ship, and they take it, and they capture it on the high seas, and they take it to the port of Haifa. They unload it, put the people on 4 British prison ships, in spite of what they endured. The crew, some of them escaped, some of them accompanied the passengers, and they were deployed and sent to France and told to get off of these ships or they were going to be in serious trouble. And the people on Exodus refused to get off. And when they refused to get off, 6 weeks in the hot summer of July and August, they were stuck in the port outside of France, and subsequently the British took these people and disembarked them with fire hoses and all kinds of material and pushed them back into displaced persons camp in the British zone, and that's where they stayed until they eventually got to Israel after the partition of the state. Now, the confrontation between the British ships, there were cruisers, 7 cruisers and destroyers. They then accosted the ship on the seas, and this is shown here in a drawing, which subsequently becomes a watercolor drawing, which I will show you. And this was showing the Exodus in the middle, and this is the chosen one. It's turned into a watercolor by Tom Freeman, being rammed by 2 British, I believe, destroyers or cruisers. And this is the events that bring the ship. The ship's people, you can see, try to fight off the British, but they're no match for the British. About 3 people die, one of the crew, and 140 people are injured. But this story goes on and on and on in newsprint and media for at least 6 weeks, and it captures the world's attention. And this is why the Exodus and its capture and subsequent treatment of the refugees that had suffered in Europe becomes such a world event. It was a print media event. Now, I want to call your attention to something very, very important here about this ship. Not only is this ship historically in its own times, but it marks a very significant juncture, because a ship begins World War II, the St. Louis, when they don't allow Jews escaping from the Nazis to land, and it ends with the ship Exodus, which is now bringing the Jewish people back to their homeland. And it's fascinating, but the word peace occurs as the 4 times in Talmud and 4 tractate, and the final word of peace is in the Talmud, the words of Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, who says, Adonai oz li'amo yitain, Adonai yavarech et amo v'shalom. God will grant you strength and he will grant you peace. That ends the Talmud. Notice that strength, physical strength, psychological strength, the determination is first. And only when you have that will you have true peace. And that's what this is all about, the vessel of peace. Thank you very much. I hope you can use these resources effectively to teach your children the power and the dynamism that this ship holds historically, both for Baltimore and for the world. Thank you.
My announcement today marks the beginning of a new approach to conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. In 1995, Congress adopted the Jerusalem Embassy Act, urging the federal government to relocate the American embassy to Jerusalem and to recognize that that city, and so importantly, is Israel's capital. This act passed Congress by an overwhelming bipartisan majority and was reaffirmed by a unanimous vote of the Senate only 6 months ago. Yet for over 20 years, every previous American president has exercised the law's waiver, refusing to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem or to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital city. Presidents issued these waivers under the belief that delaying the recognition of Jerusalem would advance the cause of peace. Some say they lacked courage, but they made their best judgments based on facts as they understood them at the time. Nevertheless, the record is in. After more than 2 decades of waivers, we are no closer to a lasting peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. It would be folly to assume that repeating the exact same formula would now produce a different or better result. Therefore, I have determined that it is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.